We are live, though. Hey, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. This is Ben Rojan, Seattle data guy, here with Tom. Tom, do you want to give a quick background on yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Tom Rampley. I've been in the data space in various ways for I'd say about 15 to 20 years. Been leading data teams for the last 10, based in Denver, and currently heading up data for Velocity Global HR tech startup here in the Denver area.
Yeah. We actually met here in Denver. I think, was it a year ago at this point? There's like a 5 Tran roadshow. I don't
know. Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Or it could have been earlier this year. But yeah, we met, and I'm glad we always kept connected because I think you always comment interesting points on my posts, and I really enjoy that. So
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, the LinkedIn data community is really interesting because they're, all those LinkedIn. All the LinkedIn specialty communities are a mix of like really good content and then just people trying to get a post out there every day to promote their brand, which is totally fine. Like that's a thing you have to do if you want to establish a foothold as a content creator. But I feel like the data folks, the ratio of good stuff to promotion is actually pretty high relative to some other communities I've seen. So yeah, it's a good one to be involved in and to comment on, because you will get a lot of responses and people will put a lot of really valuable stuff out there for free. So I appreciate the content that I do get there.
Yeah. That's why, like, half the time, I swear, I just put out posts and I'm like, I just want to hear other people's opinions on this. Like, I think I posted about the medallion architecture, and I'm like, I've thought about this for the last 2 years, but I haven't said anything. I just want to know, like, what's everyone's thoughts on it? Am I only the one who thinks this way? Probably also because I work by myself for the most part, so it's good to like get that water cooler talk every once in a while. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So just so everyone kind of knows, like, again, you kind of brought up earlier, you've got about, I think, 10 years of experience just leading data teams. So you've really been doing data for a lot longer. But how'd you get into data? Like, what brought you this way?
Well, so as an undergrad, I studied psychology and finance. Got 2 degrees and learned a lot of statistics in psych, and then like many people, got very proficient with Excel as part of my finance degree. And in the early 2000s, like that was actually still a pretty bankable skill. Maybe it still is. I don't know anymore. But when I got out of school, I worked in banking and insurance for about 8 years and just did a lot of data work. I found myself very naturally falling into it. I think I had a talent for it. Certainly when I did it, I kept getting asked to do more, and just always really enjoyed it. It always struck me as the best way to really understand the business, to not focus solely on kind of high level narratives about what you do and how things work, but actually dig into the data at a very deep level and really understand how the sausage is made and how processes operate across the company. So I did that for a while, and I really enjoyed it. The 2008, working in banking in 2008 was not a good thing. It was a very dangerous place to be. And like the bank I was working for at the time ended up not quite going under, but laid off like 80-90% of its workforce. Wow. I was among that. So, and the job I was able to get after, again, it was a rough time, not a great job, set me back a little bit in my career. So like many people who experience kind of a early career setback, I said, I'm gonna get my MBA, which I wanted to do anyway, but the timing was right because I wasn't loving what I was doing. So I went back to Indiana University and got my MBA at Kelly, which was a ton of fun, and I learned a lot. And after that, I had really planned to go back into finance. I'd studied a fair amount of quantitative finance in school, and that's really what I wanted to do. But after talking to some consulting firms, talking to some some of the Wall Street banks, like it wouldn't have been a very good fit. But I knew I'd always wanted to live out west, so I was able to get a job as a data scientist at Dish Network in 2012. To this day, I don't really know why they hired me. I had a decent stats background and certainly a lot of history of creating value by analyzing data, but like a true data science, I was not a data scientist by any means when they hired me. I could do simple regression analysis and whatnot, but like I was not really a data scientist. So I basically spent the first year just spending all my time learning as much about machine learning as I possibly could. Again, luckily I had a fairly strong stats background, so that made it achievable to do it by myself. And because I'd always had an interest in the connection of data to business processes, I was able to find quite a few places where that expertise and that I newly developed in machine learning could add some value, and where predictive analytics were really going to move the needle. Had a few successes on a variety of projects, and they put a few people under me, and that's how I started leading data teams. So I started off leading data science teams within tech there at Dish Network, and eventually took over leading all of their client-facing advertising analytics, which was really fun. Selling client-facing analytics and data products was a totally different thing from doing internally facing stuff, and I loved it. From there, I got a job running a broader data organization at a telecommunications company called Windstream. Went and did that for about 5 years, and kind of reached the end of. Company wasn't doing great. Kind of reached the end of what was interesting about that job. So then I jumped into the startup world, and now I'm running data for Velocity Global, which has been great because I got to grow my team from 1 person when I got here to 17, and we're about to grow a whole lot more going into 2024. So it's been a really great experience.
Yeah. I think it's something interesting here in Denver is there's so many kind of telecommunications. Like I feel like I know like a dozen people that work for Dish here, and then there's Lumen, and then so I don't know. That's always interesting. But also the whole they hired me as a data scientist, but I was just doing regression analysis. But I think that's often kind of an interesting joke that even data scientists who spend a genuine amount of time learning more complex things and then get into the industry, and then it's okay, but they really just need something that's considerably different than what I learned, which I
even beyond that, I think that that was 11 years ago now, and both the expectations for data science, the kind of people who can break into those roles, and what those roles even look like has changed massively. I think if you look at the close of the aughts and the early 10s, a lot of companies still, even large companies, had very, very limited data science operations, if any. And what they were looking for when they hired data scientists was often fairly nebulous. Yeah. I think now that companies much better understand where data scientists are really going to add value, and the different kind of varieties of data science work, because really data science, I think now is a very overloaded term. That can be somebody who's basically an analyst within the business, but who understands time series analysis. Take whatever, they're an economist by training. So that's what they do. And their output really is PowerPoints, right? And they advise senior management on what they should do. And that's their output. On the other side, you have what my team does here at Velocity Global, which is we're on the tech side and we are building products. We are building products that will be utilized either internally or by our clients. And it's much more akin to software engineering than kind of the analytic side of data science. So, I do think you have somewhat of a bifurcation between those two realms. And that's to say nothing of the research guys, who are employed at Meta and Google, who are actually building, LLMs, to use a very topical example, right? Who are actually building kind of really pure data science tooling.
Yeah, and I think that was an eventual distinction that they tried to make at a lot of companies, whether it was Zillow, I think did this, Meta, and a few other companies, where it's we're going to have data scientists who are, I think, a little more general, and then we're going to have research scientists. And those were generally PhDs. I think it's generally what people envision when they think of data science, at least the initial data science. Maybe now it's a little broader, but especially that initial first wave, it was oh, you've got to have a PhD. You're going to be doing deep research. But now I think it's definitely shifted to be okay, it could be product analysis with some A/B testing or something in there that's we're going to use that role in that title. And people can argue all day if that's the right term or the wrong term, but that's the way it is. It's the way I like to.
Yeah, it's by convention, all terms are. So
yeah, exactly. Before diving too deep into it, what do you do when you're not looking at data and solving data problems?
I've been a competitive martial artist for years. I've got a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and have competed, for 20 years. had some kickboxing fights. I'm aging out of that a little bit. Every time I get too intense now, I don't compete anymore. And every time I train too intensely, I end up breaking something. So currently my LCL's a little torn. So rehabbing that. But, my older son, this being Colorado, is getting really into competitive climbing. So I've been doing a lot of that with him, which is fun. And then I'm a musician. If I was at my home office, you'd see just guitars and amps all over my back wall. So yeah, there's a pretty good bluegrass jam scene here in Denver. So I'm as active as I can be with working kids in that scene.
Yes. Yeah, you would then enjoy my old manager from Meta, because he would just like acquire old amps and fix them. And so like he would like send pictures, and like his walls would just be covered with amps and things, and like, play bluegrass and different. Awesome. Like I think he was part of 4 bands before COVID started, and all that. So it was very busy. It was very fun. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So, for me, one reason I kind of reached out, I mean, again, you always have, I think, really good comments whenever I post. I think the big thing is, like, again, you've been running data teams for the last decade. I think the biggest, or some of the issues that you run into is trying to figure out exactly what you're supposed to be doing. Like, okay, what do we actually do for the business, right? I think Joe Reese recently kind of went on a talk where he was like, you know what, I think we need to stop talking about like specific value and just start delivering. So I'm just curious, like, how do you view like actually giving the business what they need? One, making sure it's valuable, but also just making sure you're actually just delivering at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's very difficult because depending on how you approach working with the business, the value that you deliver can actually be very, very nebulous, right? It's very hard to put a price tag on knowing how your business functions. Yeah. I mean, everybody agrees you need to do it. Like, companies have BI teams, but how do you say that, hey, this decision that I made that saved us $5 million over the next 3 years, I was able to make because of this report, and tie that back to, my airflow spend, right? That's very, very hard to do. And I think that for BI people, and I've certainly found this myself, that nebulousness creates a real problem where, it's hard at budget season to justify spend. And it can be very hard to, in some instances, to be taken really seriously as a part of engineering teams, right? Because you've got your application developers who are most of a tech organization, and they're producing things that clients use, that you sell. And it's very easy to become a second-class citizen, frankly, as a data person. So, I think that when you look at how to avoid that trap, the most important thing that I have learned, and where I'm at, 10 years in, so this could change, that's subject to change, but is this notion of really trying to treat everything that you're building as a product. Mm-hmm. And so what do I mean by that? Well, for those in your audience who do not work in tech and don't have the luxury of like working with product teams, there's this notion that the development process is essentially you have a group called product, and they're going to work with customers and work with folks internally and figure out like what are the features we need to bring to market. They'll work with all the stakeholders to figure out what the requirements are, what is the must have, what's the nice to have, et cetera. They'll prioritize all that for you. Then they'll come to you as engineers and say, here's what you need to build, right? And it's a conversation, but they're kind of doing that piece for you. If you are in a tech organization where you have a data product manager, you should count yourself as very lucky. Most people don't, and they're going to have to do that themselves. So what does that mean? Well, you own data. You need to determine who are the personas I'm serving, right? Is this strictly internal? Am I just looking at internal clients? Do I have to, service operations, marketing, finance, et cetera? Or do I have an externally facing component where I can create value for the business with my data? Once you've determined those personas, you have to try and figure out like what are the needs that these people have. And I don't mean the data needs specifically, like just their general business needs. Like, what are the features that they need to help run their business better? If you're dealing with internal stakeholders or for clients, like what problem are you solving as a business for these people? And then you say, all right, my asset is data. What I bring to the table is data expertise, potentially data science, machine learning expertise. How can I start solving these problems for these folks? Once you've done that, you have to work with them very closely, and you have to create buy-in, right? They have to agree that, yes, this is a thing we need. I agree you can produce it. Ideally, you want to say, what's the value it's going to create? Can you figure out some kind of tangible metric, even if it's a bit of a stretch, to put on this, and make sure that as you're delivering the product that you're measuring that, right, that you follow up, so that at the end of the year you can say like, hey, I built these 3 things. Here's the benefit that we expected from it. Here's how I measured for that benefit. And yes, I achieved it, or didn't, as the case may be. But the engineering part, honestly, in many cases is the easiest. I think the people in the data space often understand the technologies and the approaches very, very well. And they can build almost anything. The hardest part is getting business alignment about what needs to be built, and making sure that you have a clear pathway to showing the value, to demonstrating the value you're delivering, right?
Yeah.
And again, this is not easy, but I think it's really really essential. And it really goes not, for all aspects of data. If you have an internal visualization tool you're supporting, like Tableau or Looker, don't just build a dashboard whenever anybody asks you for a dashboard. Like that, try to work with them to really understand, like, what's the question you're trying to answer, what's the value you're going to deliver if you answer that question, and how do we best structure what we're going to deliver to you to do so, and how do we measure whether or not you can actually do so. Can you answer the questions that you sought to answer after we've built this? You have to think about things in a product perspective, because that's really how you drive value. And I think the other thing that is really nice from that product perspective is going through that whole process creates a lot of rigor in what you're doing. It creates a seriousness about what you're doing. And again, if you're just dashing off reports every time somebody puts a ticket in your Jira queue, it's really easy to get sloppy with that. And if you treat things as a product, make sure you're going through the steps of understanding the need, really being gathering the requirements, and really understanding what the customer is trying to get to before you deliver. I think that does make you much more careful and thorough in the products that you do deliver.
Yeah. I think the one thing you brought up, like having business alignment, and like how do you feel like you can like get that? Is there ways you can communicate with the business to understand what they're really needing? Is it just by asking them kind of what they do in their day-to-day and be like, okay, that's kind of what they do, and this is how I can help them? Or how do you get to a point where it's like, not only is it like the business is saying they need something, I can actually see what they need, because they're going to say something like, we need real-time LLMs, and you're going to be like, what? So how do you take that and like be like, okay, this is what they actually mean and need?
Yeah, so I think that is actually a fairly difficult thing for a data leader to drive independently, because I think that the way you achieve that, and this might be my bias as somebody with a business background, but the way that you achieve that is you try to get involved in the strategic planning and decision making of the business, and get a good sense of what's really important to the business as a whole. If you wait for people to come to you, like, it's just not going to happen. And if you just go to a business leader and say like, hey, what do you need? Like, they don't usually have the context to necessarily even know what's possible. One of the really important things about being a data leader, I think, is finding ways to get into conversations about the direction the business is going, what you're trying to accomplish, what your tactics and strategy are to accomplish that, and then help the business people to understand where the data you have is going to help. And I think one of the most effective ways to do that is around metrics. So every business is trying to measure what they're doing. They're trying to measure their success. How are those metrics defined? How is that data captured? Do you have unity across the organization of the metrics definition and what the source of truth is? I think if you as a data person can get with, especially if you can get with senior leadership, if you're lucky enough to have that opportunity, and start driving that conversation around metrics, that can be a very good way to get into those meetings, because anything you're doing, there's always the question, well, how do we measure the success of this? Yeah. And if you can if you can, and this takes a long time, but if you can establish a culture where every time an initiative is proposed, um, one of the questions that arises is, okay, how are we going to measure this? How do we make sure that the data guys know what we need to look at? What are our North Star KPIs? That can be a very effective way to get yourself in the mix of what's going on in the broader business organization. But yeah, I mean, it's a challenge, and I think this is one where there are organizations where that culture doesn't exist, and those organizations tend to not be very data driven. And honestly, it can be very, very difficult as a data person at those organizations to make a difference, because you are functionally a support organization, right? I mean, unless you're one of the few businesses where your product is just data or derived data products, ML apps, whatever. The business can run without you. Not as well, but they can. And if that's what they're going to do, then that's a difficult culture to change.
Yeah, actually, that I've had people reach out to me working for those types of companies where it's like, they've got data, they're kind of doing something, but they have, they're obviously not going to ever be taken any more seriously or play any strategic role, regardless of how much the company might even say they want to be data driven, right? So do you have any recommendations? Because I think especially from even both in terms of can they do anything? Is it even possible to change it?
Yeah.
Or two, is there anything they should do for careers? Because I think especially if you're early on in your career, there's probably some thoughts there.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think if you find yourself a data leader in an organization like that, the first thing you should try to do is find an executive level champion, right?
Yeah.
Find the COO, find the vice president of marketing, like somebody who really does want to be data driven and really takes that seriously. And then devote a lot of your time to helping that person, that group, because ultimately to create value, you need that engagement. And if you reach out and you try to engage with folks and they don't want to, you should keep trying, but you shouldn't bang your head against a wall, right? Go where you're needed and go where people really care about what you're doing and value it. So try to find that leader who's going to help, and hopefully, if they do become more data driven and they take advantage of what you bring to the table as a data team, that's something that shows value and gets adopted by the broader company. I think if you can't find anybody like that, probably not the best place to be working in data.
Yeah.
If you're early career, honestly, learn what you can and then find a different gig. I think that, myself as a hiring manager, I've hired hundreds of people over the years, maybe not that many, but a lot. I don't really worry that much about seeing people move between jobs fairly frequently early in their career. I mean, you don't want to have 15 stints of 4 months, right?
Yeah.
That's bad. But if you're a year here at one place, 2 years at another place, and you do that for the first few years, I don't really think that much of it. So, don't feel if you're somebody who's just out of school in your first data job and, maybe you've worked at your company for a year and a half and just nothing's going on in data there and you're worried about what it's going to look like if you leave, I really wouldn't worry about it that much. If you've developed all the skills you're going to develop, move on. Early career, honestly, make enough money to live. You got to make some money. But really what I think you should be focused on is figuring out what you want to do and growing your skill set as much as possible. And if that means a fair amount of movement between companies for the first 5 or 10 years of your career, that's fine.
Yeah. No, I think I definitely probably agree there. It's always hard, but I think I've had situations where it's I was like, okay, I've got the job here, which is good because you have to give your first job or something, but I need to leave now.
Yeah.
So I'm already applying, already at this moment. If you do work for a company that again is a little more data driven, do you feel like you should develop templates to kind of tell if a project's doing well or something? So you brought up metrics and things like that. Do you feel like there's a process that needs to get developed, or do you think it can kind of happen organically where it's we don't need to have too much structure around this. We can kind of tell if there's value.
No, you need to have a process.
Yeah.
It's there's no one size fits all, right? Like some organizations will end up needing more process and more defined templating. Some will need less. But you always need some sort of a process. And the main thing is, again, instilling a culture where data and metrics are just part of what you do, right? So like every new feature. So I'll give you an example. One of the things that we've started doing here at Velocity Global that I really appreciate is with every PRD, so every project requirements document, one of the things that you have to include before it can be approved are what are your metrics and how are you going to measure. So when that project even gets kicked off, right, to develop a new feature, even if the data team's totally uninvolved with the actual features that are being created, there is a portion of that PRD that says here's how we're going to measure it, and we're setting up the reporting and data as that engineering is happening elsewhere in the company, so that when that product launches, we can immediately start measuring its success, right? So not super template heavy. I mean, that's not really important, but you find the key places where you make it a requirement to have data involved, and you be religious about that, right? And again, I keep going back to culture. So much of this is culture. If you're in a situation where that's something just people pay lip service to, but you don't really have to do it before you can proceed with the project, some executive's going to greenlight a project without any way of measuring whether or not it's successful. That's a culture that isn't very data driven, and that's a problem, right? So, you can put it on a template, but ultimately it's about culture, and it's about having senior people in the organization who insist upon being able to measure the success of the work that's being done.
Yeah. You brought up obviously senior people finding champions. Do you have any tips for people who are maybe, again, early managers, early directors who need to find those champions and how they should do it so they can get buy-in?
So I think there's a certain amount of evangelizing that's necessary. When I was at Dish and we were just starting a data science team, I did go around to all the senior managers and essentially said, like, here's who we are, here's what we can do. Do you have any advice, any projects that you need help with? What are your pain points, et cetera? And a lot of them never followed up, but a few did, and that's who we ended up doing work for. So, if you're brand new in an organization, if the data team is not known, I do think a certain amount of evangelizing is necessary. But again, like it's a two-way street, right? Folks are going to engage with you, and if you can effectively deliver work for them, they will engage more. And as we mentioned earlier, if nobody's engaging, then that's maybe an organization that doesn't take data all that seriously, and maybe not the best place to be a data person.
Yeah. I think that's just generally a question. That actually makes me think. When I did work at Facebook, that was something we would do. I think once every either half or something, where you just go through what you did in the prior half to most of your stakeholders, but also like go through and be like, hey, this is what we're doing. This is what we think we should be doing. What is from your organization, like what are you guys in need of in terms of data, in terms of projects? Because we need to start putting that on a roadmap. We want to start knowing how we can drive value and deliver things for you guys.
Now, when you were at Facebook, I'm curious, was product very involved in your roadmap as a data team, or was that something that you were largely doing yourselves?
It would be very dependent on the team you worked on. The team I worked on, I like to say we were like data infrastructure, not in the sense that we like built Airflow. We like the data we built was essentially infrastructure for other data engineering teams, where it's like we would build that core layer that everyone else would essentially rely on. So we were less product heavy and more focused on just making sure that people had the right information. But definitely a lot of other if you're on Messenger or Instagram or something, you're probably talking with a product person who's being like, okay, we need to build this new feature. Then they're talking with the data science team and also the software engineering team and data engineering team and be like, okay, what data should we be tracking to tell us if this is successful, especially if it's completely new. More than likely, if you have something that's already kind of well known, it probably already has a process in place in terms of like, all right, how are we going to launch this product, right? Because that's a lot of what people would spend time on, is like launching products, and then you like release it to like 1% of people, and then 5% of people, or maybe you just release it to a certain country and see the response based on that, and then launch worldwide. But
yeah, experimentation is more fun when you actually have hundreds of millions of users, because you can do things like that.
For better or for worse. I mean, Facebook did get in trouble for doing that a little more freely than they should have. But obviously it is. I always find that funny. Like, when you look at like some sort of social or psychological like research paper, it's like N of 1,000 maybe, and you're like, okay, what did you actually gain from 1,000 people? Where it's like, if I think the one that Facebook got in trouble for, like in 2014, it was like N of 1,000,000 people, and it's like, you can gain a lot of information from that, can't you? It wasn't right, but you can get a lot of interesting insights from that. But usually I think at this point it's mostly like the big metric is probably like, do people engage more? Do people engage less? Right. Even though I think they're like, they try to view it from a perspective of like, will people get overloaded eventually and want to leave because they feel like they're spending too much time? So I think that also became a metric as well. Which, go ahead.
No, that's just interesting.
Yeah, I was gonna say, which brings up another point, which is like, do you ever think of counter metrics, or like what other things you should be looking at? Like, obviously some people's like, oh, we want to increase conversion, but if on the other side your churn is terrible, it's like, well, it's not really a good number. So do you think about that side?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's important to think about trade-offs in every decision you make, which is essentially what you're describing, right? If you take an example that I was just working on, if you're talking about, how do you tier customers from a service perspective? Well, if you explicitly define some tier of customers that's small and you're going to give them less service, but the price point's lower, how do you balance that lower cost to serve versus increased churn and decreased lifetime value, right? So no, I mean, you have to consider trade-offs in any business decision you make, and ideally those should be measurable by metrics.
Yeah. And then, so do you kind of have like a core set of metrics for every? Because you said you have these data products. Do you have like a core set of metrics for each of these? Do they kind of have like a roll-up set of metrics that kind of they all kind of fit into? How do you guys structure that?
Yeah. So generally speaking, you want to have for product specific metrics, you want it to be as close to the intended effect of the product as possible, right? Like ultimately, there's a relatively small number of metrics that most companies are really striving, right? You want your margins to be high. And they're almost all financial, right? You want your margins to be high. You want your churn to be low. It's not rocket science, but yeah, for individual projects, it's very hard to just say my metric here is churn reduction, because you might be doing 20 things that could potentially affect churn, not to mention that's something that's fairly vulnerable to just exogenous shocks and what's going on in the marketplace. So, that's not granular enough of a metric. But if you can say like, hey, I'm doing this project, and for these specific users in a specific country, we think it's going to decrease their churn over 6 months by X. Like, that's a much better metric, because it's granular to what you're actually trying to accomplish, and it gives you a much better idea if the product launch was successful or not.
Yeah, no, that does make sense. Like, I think it's very easy to be like, as a grant, for our entire product, we want to see something, but generally, I think even one of like, now I don't know why I'm on a Facebook kick, but I'm one of the first questions they often ask in the interview, at least for data engineers, like, if you saw like this sudden drop in like users in a certain area that was like live, like what would you check? And so there's something about like, like you might not notice it if it were all over the world, right? Like you might not see this blip, but there might be a blip. And they want to hear pretty much almost everything, where it's like, maybe it's something environmental, like there was a hurricane that went through and suddenly our servers are flooded, or maybe there's, whatever, 1,000 of other reasons that have nothing to do with technology per se. And so, the
first thing I'd check is if my data pipeline was broken.
Yes. Obviously, step one is did we launch new code? Okay.
I think that's always what you should check if it's named after somebody's law or somebody's rule. I wish I could remember it. Maybe you do, but that if you see a really unexpected result in your data, the first thing to always assume is that your data is wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what that rule is, but that does make sense. I think that is usually my like first response. It's like, that's not normal. Okay, is our pipeline loading? Did we get the data for today?
Yes.
What's changed?
Yeah,
Did we change logic?
good or bad,
Yeah.
right? Like if you see some new feature that's amazingly successful, like your first response shouldn't be just to to run to the CEO and tell him how great the new product is. It's what did I screw up in measuring this that it looks like it's turning around the fortunes of the company.
Wow, we've got like a 99% conversion rate. What's going on?
Yeah, I did have it's funny. One of the best model I ever built in terms of accuracy was for Dish Network, and it was a model for who would return set-top boxes. So Dish Network would send you if you canceled your service, you had to send back your receiver. They'd send you 2 boxes to pre-stamped whatever to send your box back. And we were able to build a model that was like 98.9% accurate in who would actually send a box back without us going to collections on them. And like almost the entire process of productionizing that model was trying to figure out what covariate of our dependent variable we had left in our independent variables that was causing this model to be so right. And we couldn't find it. I think it was just like an amazingly good model. But you got to be careful whenever you find something like that.
I was going to say on the flip side, I had a similar thing where we were doing readmissions at a hospital, and I was like, man, my model's like 99% right. And it's like, yes, because most people are not readmitted. So it just has to guess yes the entire time, and it is 99%.
Yeah. Well, and I say when I say 99%, I don't literally mean accuracy as a metric. I think generally speaking, in classification models, I prefer AUC or F1 score. But yeah, it was it is. You got to be really careful with your data in ML because it's so easy to accidentally leave in what are correlates of your dependent variable without meaning to. But anyway.
I think the other thing that you talked a lot about in this conversation is data products. So for some people, like what do you define as a data product, I guess?
So I really wish I could remember who I borrowed this definition from, but a data product is anything that provides value to an organization that derives that value primarily from data. So it can be data itself, right? Like if you have a lot of user data that you're just selling in some form, or it can be machine learning applications that are built upon proprietary data that you own. But so anything that's deriving its value mostly from data that that you have and nobody else does.
Yeah, that makes sense. How do you kind of view, I guess, delivering that to the business?
So I view it as largely a software engineering task. The longer I've been in data, the less the less clear the line is to me between data engineering and just software engineering. There are components you probably don't have to worry about front end components all that much, right? As a data product developer, but the core notion of how do I deliver reliable value? How do I make sure that my app doesn't break? How am I handling privacy, authorization, all the kind of steps that you go through when you're developing any other application? Those apply to most data products as well. So I see a continued convergence between data teams and software engineering teams, and from both directions too, might I add, right? Like, we talked a little bit earlier about how the title of data scientist is becoming more nebulous. I think as ML just becomes just another tool in the toolbox, there are a lot of companies that don't really need data scientists because they have some software engineers who just get into ML, and that's a thing that they can do and something that they can incorporate into their products without anybody explicitly from a data team to help them. Now you can argue that there's a lot of risk there because many many machine learning algorithms require quite a bit of specialized knowledge used correctly. But it's still something that I see happening within the industry.
Yeah, I think at Facebook, like they do kind of separate, I think, machine learning engineers and data scientists, where machine learning engineers tend to be software engineers with some ML versus the other way around. Just because it's the implementation factor that's usually like, we can probably do the basic stats. Like implementing at scale is hard. And you kind of need you need a few years of experience software, like in engineering, and not just coding, but also like, how does this interact with all of the databases and all of the all of the various other components that exist. It takes some time to get used to, and I think it's easier to add some data science and machine learning versus the vice versa.
I think it is, and this is something that I occasionally get pilloried for on social media when I say it, but I don't care. If I have to choose as a data scientist, if I have to choose between really, really, really understanding the math of every algorithm I use versus being really good at software engineering, I would choose being good at software engineering in a heartbeat. And it's not because it isn't important to understand the mathematics of the algorithms that you work with. In some cases, going back to, we talk about regression, like, yeah, you need to understand why multicollinearity and heteroskedasticity will blow up your regression model, like why those are bad things. But if you're using an LLM, do you need to be able to build a transformer from scratch? Like, I would argue you actually don't. Like, the utilization of that in a product that's going to drive value for a business is much more of a software engineering task than it is an ML task. And there are various that calculus of what's more important, like really understanding the algorithm versus understanding how to implement it and productionize it. That varies from algorithm to algorithm. But I do think the general trend within data scientists is that most of the value creation is about good software engineering rather than good math. Because it's comparative advantage, right? Like, you've got people at OpenAI and at Meta, wherever else, who are research scientists and who are building machine learning tooling that you can utilize. And you as the person working in industry, just trying to create a data product that drives value, you need to understand the pitfalls, the relative strengths of various algorithms. You need to understand at a high level how they work. But, do you need to be able to, I don't know, write your own circular coordinate descent algorithm to find the minimum of the loss function? Probably not. Like, that's not something you will ever do in your day-to-day. Do you need to know how to, build an API on top of your model to allow people to actually access it? Probably a lot more valuable skill, right, than writing the Bayes optimizer. So, for me, if I could tell anybody within the data science space, like, really optimize on the algorithmic side versus really optimize on the software engineering side, I would definitely say software engineering. The one exception I would say is if, again, we bifurcated earlier between kind of the tech side folks who are building applications versus those who are just doing analysis, like doing more advanced analysis. If you're somebody who's on the business side, spend your time understanding statistics better if that's a thing you need to do. But even there, like, I would optimize my understanding of business processes in the business before I would optimize my understanding of the mathematics, because I just think you're going to derive a lot more value from there ultimately.
No, I kind of like that thinking. I mean, again, it's always good to have a good understanding of what's going on underneath the hood, but if it's going to depend also on industry. I do think I had one person I was talking to, and they were involved in oil pipeline drilling, so they're doing like research and stuff like that, and they were talking about like some pretty heavy math, and I think that can also sometimes impact is like the work you're doing. It's like if you're doing a little more digital work, it's like, you're probably using things that are very well known, A/B testing, et cetera, things that you can kind of plug and play in. But then once you start getting into the crazy research heavy physics, it's like, what'd you say you did? That sounds like some fast Fourier transform. What? Okay.
I mean, there's a difference. we all call ourselves software engineers, and we are in a sense, but like it's important to remember that they're like real engineers who are like doing actual engineering on physical things, and the level of rigor there is needs to be higher necessarily. And look, I'm not saying you don't need to know any math. You can't be a good data scientist if you don't have a strong mathematical and statistical background.
Yeah.
You have to be good enough to know that the basic conditions for using a given algorithm are met. You have to be good enough to understand intuitively what when they're going to fail. Like, right, what are my failure conditions? If my data assumes a certain form, like what's not going to work, what's still going to work. So I'm not saying you don't need to know anything, but I do think it's a lot more important to know. It's more important to know the software engineering side than to be able to build a lot of this stuff like totally.
Yeah. Are there any kind of big wins that you're very proud of in the last with all the data products you've been building?
Yes, but I can't really talk about them.
That's fine.
I can say that we're getting very heavily into AI, and that's been really interesting. I think that my basic approach to AI is I'm really terrified to build anything that's client facing, but I think for driving down cost to serve and increasing the ability, making internal folks more productive, like there's so much that you can do with AI, especially if you're in a business like ours, which is fundamentally about like compliance and research. Because what Velocity Global does is we're an employer of record provider. We employ people on behalf of our clients in jurisdictions where they don't have legal entities. So we have supported workers all over the world, and we have to understand the labor law in 180 countries really well. So, for that sort of application, like AI is hugely helpful to speed and enable research and compliance stuff. So, it's been really, really fun to work with. It's so different too, because, as a data person, as a data scientist, you spend all day working with not always very structured, but like, I don't know, a lot of numbers, a lot of tabular data sets, like very, very firm stuff. And even when you're working with unstructured data, you're trying to apply some structure there in most instances. Whereas LLMs, it's like, I'm going to build a prompt, and now I'm going to alter it slightly and see if my results get better. And now I'm going to see, if I can, depending on how I chain the prompts, how does that change my results? Oh, I'm going to have the LLM, I'm going to do some retrieval augmented generation and have the LLM go reach out to other data sources and see how that improves my results. So there's a flavor of experimentation that is really fun versus kind of the more classical machine learning, which, is fairly well understood, I think, for most applications.
Are you guys using any, there's tons of solutions. Are you just using OpenAI, or are you using into other solutions that maybe try to help support that?
We are. I would say that probably the thing that we're using the most is LangChain. So my engineers have been getting pretty into LangChain and what's possible in terms of chain of thought prompting and structuring applications with multiple passes through the LLM. So that's been pretty interesting.
Nice. That's I'm always curious, like where that's all going, and it's cool to hear people actually using it and not just being like, oh yeah, it's going to change the world, but not talking about how. So it's I can definitely see, like, again, if you're going through like compliance and legal stuff, like legal documents where it's probably thousands of pages, it's like, we need to know, like, what do we need to worry about in this country, or what are some ways that we can improve our service, in some for someone based on compliance and things of that nature.
Yep. Yeah, that's a lot of it.
Yeah.
It has been very interesting.
What was I trying to think? Do you have any thoughts in terms of like everyone's always going to feel like, oh man, it's going to take away my job? Any thoughts there in that space?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to take some jobs, but I think that will be a secondary effect. I think the main effect is it will make people a lot more productive, and which is great because the only time that GDP and wages really grow is increases in productivity, or wages anyway, maybe not GDP. But no, I think it'll make a lot of people a lot more productive. I think it'll actually free people up from doing a lot of parts of their job that are very dull. If I want to be a little speculative, in 20 years, probably not even that long, but I'll go a little conservative. There should be nobody whose job it is to read a PDF and type in stuff right from it. Like that just should not exist because AI can just do it so much better. You ever heard of a guy named Vin Vashishta?
I feel like I do. He's got that. Yeah, I know Vin Vashishta.
Yeah. So he was on the Super Data Science podcast, great podcast if you never listened to it. And he said something which was super useful to me, which was that one of the primary ways to think about AI is about making more things possible by driving down unit costs, essentially. Yeah. And I have found that, maybe I shouldn't say I've found that to be true because it's still a little early for me to say that with certainty. But that's where I see it having the most near-term potential. And that's certainly the approach that I'm taking towards it, is just trying to say, where can I find things that are expensive to do that now I can do for free or very cheaply, right? Using AI and either, serve more customers with the same number of support staff, operational staff, or I can now provide services to customers that I never could before because it was too expensive at the margin to do so. But now because of AI, it's economically feasible. So I actually think there's probably a lot of use cases where AI does make it possible for businesses to do things for customers that just simply were not profitable in the past. And every industry is going to have to figure those out for themselves, and I'm sure they will. But I do think there's a lot of very real potential with LLMs in the way that there probably isn't with some other recent tech fads like blockchain, for instance.
Yes, yeah, I do think that I've definitely utilized even some basic Copilot and also similar like LangChain, and it's like the use is very clear. Like it's like, I can see a lot of ways this could be useful. Obviously, you have to put a business model around it, or you have to have very clear use cases. But it feels far more real than I always stared at blockchain like, I'm not sure. Like, it's not very clear.
I need a big distributed database that nobody owns. Like, well, do I need that? I don't think I need that. It's interesting you mentioned Copilot because one place where I do think LLMs could be revolutionary if they're not already is in software development, because it's interesting. It's, what was it that I've heard people say, like, and I think it's true, they're better than junior developers, but like not as good as senior developers. So it does create a little bit of a difficulty in getting people to like do their own work early so they can do better work later.
Yeah.
You can, and I know certainly for myself, when there's something that I need that I don't want to become an expert in, from a coding standpoint, like I'm mostly a Python guy, Python and R. But if I need to write some JavaScript, like, am I going to go learn get really good JavaScript? I know some, but nothing in the front end, right? So, if I want to design a UI, like, no, that's going to be a ChatGPT 4 designed UI, right? Because now I wouldn't put it into production, in a company, but at the same time, I'm also never going to go become an expert at designing front end JavaScript components because, why? So I do think there's some potential for disruption there, but for the most part, it just makes people really productive. And certainly if you are somebody who already understands how to write good code and you just need to know how to do something that you haven't done before, utilize some library, man, it's hard to beat. Actually, my biggest aha moment with GPT-3 was I just been playing with it a little, and sometimes it mostly gave me good answers, sometimes it didn't make much sense, whatever. But I just kind of on a whim, it's like, I want to look up the weather, but I'm going to do it via an API called the National Weather Service. And I don't want to write this API call from scratch. So I just told ChatGPT, like, hey, write me an API call to the National Weather Service to tell me what the weather is going to be in Louisville, Kentucky in 2 weeks. That's where my parents live, and I was going.
Yeah.
And it did. And I pulled, copied the Python code, ran it, and it just returned 77 and sunny. It's like, wow, that just worked, right?
Yeah.
I think that was probably the first time that I really thought, like, man, this is entirely for real. That was very impressive to me.
Yeah, I was recently poking around with like some Docker things around it, even too, where I was like, I want to set up this Docker implementation with Airflow. Can you do it for me? And it was like, oh yeah, here it is. And and you run it and it works, and you're like, okay, why would I ever do this ever again myself? Right? Like, obviously you have to go in there and toggle a few things, but overall it's like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah,
pretty much just works. We have like 2 minutes left, so I want to be a little bit cognizant of your time, but you brought up cost, so I'm just curious. There was a lot of talk about cost recently in the last, like, maybe 2 weeks ago or a week ago, when Snowflake and Instacart and all the fun stuff kind of came out. Just generally, it doesn't have to be about that, but any thoughts on costs and data infrastructure and bringing down per unit costs, but like on the data side?
Man. Well, so I'll give you one really specific thing. If you are a Snowflake shop and you are not engaging a vendor to help you optimize your Snowflake spend, I think you're probably doing it wrong. Yeah. So I'll give a plug to one of the companies we work with. It's called Keebo, Keebo. Okay. And essentially what they do is, for a very reasonable fee, they optimize your warehouse utilization on an automated basis to just to help you save money on Snowflake. And I think it's cut our cost by like 25%, maybe 30, really big savings. There's another guy that I've talked to both on LinkedIn and professionally named Ian Whitestone, who runs a similar service, and very knowledgeable guy. So if you're running Snowflake, like, those are two good folks to reach out to. Absolutely. They're going to be able to help you and save you money on net. But in terms of reducing costs generally, I think a lot of businesses store too much data, frankly. There's a lot of stuff that people ETL that's not needed. And I think that if you're running something like Snowflake, let's say you're running Snowflake on AWS, there's probably a fair amount of data that you have that you could just offload to S3 Glacier and you'd be totally fine, because nobody's ever going to need it. You're paying for it every day. I think from a compute perspective, it's really important to do continual data hygiene. One of the things, I love DBT. Don't necessarily love the new pricing, but I really like it as a product. But it makes it very easy to set up models that just run forever. Yeah. And if nobody's using those models, well, like with Snowflake, we're Snowflake shop, compute is expensive. So, you might be able to say, if you've been running DBT on top of Snowflake for a few years and you've got a big bunch of legacy models, you should really go see if anybody's actually using those. Because I know for us, like, over 50% of our Snowflake cost is related to models that are running in DBT.
Yeah.
And, like, I don't have any sense of whether or not that's kind of a normal number, high, low for industry. Maybe but one of the things we're going to be doing in Q4 is a whole inventory of, our Looker dashboards and our DBT models and see what's getting utilized, because my guess is probably at least a quarter, if not a third of that, is hardly driving any value anymore. But again, we're paying for it constantly. So I think anytime you're dealing with these cloud services, you just have to be really vigilant about whether or not the money you're spending is still driving any value on the business side, because in many cases you're going to find it's not. And it's your responsibility, like, as a leader especially, one of your main responsibilities is to control that cost and to make sure that your cost to value ratio or value to cost ratio is positive, right? So that's the advice I would give people is don't sleep on those. And honestly, like any DevOps person would tell you the same, right? Don't sleep on those cloud compute costs. They pile up quickly, and it's your job, big part of your job, to be vigilant that you're spending your firm's money wisely and actually deriving some value from it.
Yeah, no, I think that kind of is what I was thinking, and I think no one liked that DBT new pricing model, and they rolled it back. Of course, the question just becomes, when do they roll something else forward? Because I don't know if you're on DBT Cloud, but they clearly want they have a.
I actually didn't know that they'd rolled it back because we're actually an enterprise customer, and so I didn't, since we have a contract, I didn't have to really engage with it for a while, for a few more months, so I hadn't dug into it deeply. When did they do that?
Okay, so maybe you're talking about that. So there's 2 pricing changes, right? Like there's 2, right?
Okay, I know that I know the per seat charge went up, and then I know, so that was the first one, and then they also increased they changed their pricing so it was based on model runs.
Both. Also, it was both. So yeah. So per seat still doubled, but they rolled back for now, I think, the per model run cost.
Okay.
Everyone was like, what are you talking about?
Maybe we won't move up enterprise to open source then.
Yeah. So I think that's what happened. Like, basically the entire discussion became, here's how to roll off of DBT Cloud. And they're like, maybe this is not what we want. I think the hard thing, right? Like, it's like they have, what is it, like a $4.5 billion valuation?
Yeah.
Like, how it's a big number. It's a big number to hit. You have to start justifying it. And I imagine with $50 seats, it's got to be pretty hard to get there.
Yeah.
So I get it. I understand why you're trying to do that, but it's hard. Like, it's hard for people not to feel a little bit tricked.
I mean, look, like, companies raise their prices, but it's going to be really hard for you if you offer what is essentially your core package for free, and you're also trying to, you either you don't charge a whole lot for the premium version, or the premium version is a whole lot better and justifies the additional spend. And I'm not sure that they've quite hit the sweet spot there yet. Which, I mean, they have it's a great product, but you gotta, pricing's hard.
Pricing is hard. Is part of the game, and is a hard part of the game that we can. I won't pretend. I was like, I've had my fair share as a consultant, like, trying to figure out, like, what is a fair price for everyone to be happy here. Awesome. Well, I don't want to keep you too long. It's already 1:04. I really appreciate your time here. Is there any final thoughts you have?
No, not really. I would tell anybody who's not part of the data discussion on LinkedIn, like I said, it's pretty good, and don't be afraid to ask questions. I think Reddit too has really good data engineering forums. Folks on there are very knowledgeable. I post on there myself from time to time. That'd be about it. It's a fast moving area, so just keep, always stay on top of learning a lot, and enjoy it.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Tom.
Yes.
And thanks so much everyone else for joining in. Awesome. And we can sign off. I'll hit end stream.